Of Dr. BMN College of Home Science, Postgraduate Department of English, SNDT Women's University, and the Stellenbosch University, South Africa. The conference is to conceptualize new theories of South Asian and South African feminisms based on lived experiences and their representations in literature and culture. I request the dignitaries to kindly take their seats on the stage, please. With an engaging pre-conference workshop on emerging issues and concerns in conceptualizing South-South feminism held at Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangralaya yesterday, I wish all the participants a wonderful day of continued deliberations and discussions on the emerging theme of talking across cultures. I welcome the dignitaries. I request Professor Dr. Mala Pandurang, Principal Dr. BMN College of Home Science and the convener of the conference, to kindly deliver the welcome address.
Very good morning. And special welcome to our keynote speakers from the University of Stellenbosch, South Africa, Dr. Nadia Sanger and Dr. Megan Jones. To Dr. Drupati, who is the head of Department of English at Postgraduate Studies of English, SNDT Women's University. To our guests from outside India, Dr. Gina Morrison from the Wilkes University, Pennsylvania State, United States. Dr. Delphine Munoz, who has come in from Belgium. We have Dr. Swati, who has come in from Calcutta. We also have other delegates who have come in from different parts of India. We have our own colleagues from different parts of the city, and they will be joining us shortly as the conference proceeds. And a very, very warm welcome to my dear students. To the members of the Women's Cell, Dr. Kavita and your committee members, because we do have a very active Women's Cell who do a lot of gender sensitization programs. To the students from the PG Department of English who have joined us this morning, and to my own dear students. Many of you may be wondering, why are we sitting for a conference? I can see you nodding your head. Why are we sitting for a conference on South-South feminisms, how does it concern us? And a general reaction that most of you give, it's not in our syllabus and we are not studying it. Okay? You are doing a paper on women's issues. Some of you have already started with the paper. Some of you will do the paper perhaps in the next semester or after that. And there are many terms that you're going to come across. I'm sure that your teachers have already discussed these terms with you: gender, patriarchy, power, representation. And the idea is for you to start thinking about these issues, especially as young women of the 21st century. And as all of you know, the motto of the college is empowerment of women through quality in education. There will be many things that you may not know. I hope you will be curious enough to find out more about it. You may not know where is University of Stellenbosch. The information will be available to you at a fingertip. Not now, but please do it later. Check it up. I hope all of you know where South Africa is. Yes? I hope all of you know what is there in South Africa, what is the rich heritage of South Africa, what is the political situation in South Africa. That's very important to know. Okay? We will get a brief introduction to that, and we are looking to set up exchange between students, online exchange programs of exchanging ideas about where women are placed, what are issues that we faced, what are gender issues. And I think it's very important that the exchange happens at the level of students. Are you looking forward to that? This will be followed by a brief lecture cum demonstration by Ms. Sanjukta. The introduction will come a little later. But I request all of you to take in as much as you can, absorb as much as you can. And I think when you don't know something and you get to know it, then it should be a very exciting experience for you. I would like to thank the University of Stellenbosch for collaborating with us on this conference. This is a public event, but there will be the closed discussions after lunch. We've had intensive discussions yesterday, and we'll continue with that today. I'd like to thank Dr. Drupati from SNDT University, our parent body, and Dr. Manisha is also here for collaborating with us. It would not have been possible without their collaboration. And of course, the organizing team of Dr. BMN College, who have worked very hard, I think, to make this conference a reality. I would like to thank Ria, our young photographer from BCA. We believe in empowering our students, so we call upon our own girls to help us out. Thank you, Ria, for the initiative to take the photos. And although the textile students are not here, the conference bags are made by our textiles department. And it's a wonderful Earn As You Learn initiative that has been made from them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mala ma'am, for your inspiring words. You always continue to empower our students, not just in this college, but in academies across the world. I now invite Dr. Draupadi Chattopadhyay, Head Department of English, SNDT Women's University, to kindly brief the audience about the Interdisciplinary International Conference.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the conference. Yesterday we had an excellent series of deliberations, and today we will continue with that. And as Mala ma'am said, that we will also have a public lecture, which will be followed by a lecture cum demonstration, which will put into practice a lot of things that we've been talking about of women's lived experiences, as it were. Just to let you know that this is probably one of the few and one of the first kind of collaborative efforts on South-South feminisms in India, where we are collaborating with an institution from South Africa And something that you might have noticed in your literature classrooms or your gender studies classrooms, that we continuously look towards the global north to understand about our own lived experiences and even South Asian feminisms, as it were. So this, I hope, will be a very new experience for all of us and will be, our first step towards probably understanding beyond the critical frameworks that we are now so comfortable with. So India has a long history with South Africa, not just colonial history, predating colonial history. We have had trade relations with South Africa, or what is now called modern South Africa. All of us know that a lot of these nomenclatures are also due to our colonial history. So we have thought probably beyond nations before our colonial histories began, and that is also something that we need to keep in mind. But our entangled histories, cultures have rarely been explored. And when they do find their ways in academic discussions, they are often always rooted through the West. So we understand also these entangled histories, which are part of our thinking processes also through the West. So this conference will be an attempt towards moving away from that sort of dyadic framework. And this is a rare opportunity where scholars from South Africa have come to discuss possibilities of understanding our cultures, not merely in relation to the West. So this is probably the first time, at least in the history of the department, that we are directly talking to scholars from South Africa. An understanding of gender identities is one such area where we can make significant inroads into developing a South-South framework, because these alliances, as it were, are something that we've been exploring for some time. And these alliances, as we discussed in our deliberations yesterday, there is already a framework, there is already a skeletal structure of these alliances that exist. And now probably is the opportune moment to then develop it further. Strategies of resistance, for instance, in feminist critical frameworks provide a fertile ground for these alternative understandings beyond Western critical ecologies. And this is something that we will try to do in particular today. So this might prove to be a beginning of a long series of questioning of centrality of the West in our respective critical frameworks. So all of us here are hoping, we are very, very hopeful, we are very positive that this is going to be one of many deliberations that we are going to have. And this will change our classrooms, as we discussed yesterday, and will begin conversations that we have not been having for a long time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Chattopadhyay, for giving us a brief on the emerging theme. And I'm sure South-South feminism will be discussed much at length during the intensive sessions. It gives me a great privilege now to introduce our two keynote speakers, Dr. Nadia Sanger and Dr. Megan Jones from the Stellenbosch University. Dr. Megan Jones holds a PhD degree from the University of Cambridge. She lectures in English studies at the Stellenbosch University. Her most recent publications include Imagining the Migrant in 21st Century Johannesburg, the Cambridge Companion to the City in World Literature, which is forthcoming in 2023, Reading the Rubbish Dump at Heterotopia in Neil Blokam's district, and many other publications as well. She's the author of Everybody is Here, Reading South Africa through the 21st Century Township, which is also in production in 2023. Welcome, Dr. Megan. Dr. Nadia. Dr. Nadia Sanger also works as a lecturer in the Department of English Studies at Stellenbosch University. Her research is in interdisciplinary and studies in arts, humanities, and social sciences, with an interest in feminist studies and critical race theory. She's worked as a feminist researcher for 17 years with research institutions as well as universities in South Africa, and she holds a postdoctoral Fulbright scholarship. Dr. Sanger is a co-editor of a book on racism, violence, betrayal, and new imaginaries, which was published this year, and has published several journals and books on representations of identities in literature and popular culture. She's also one of the co-editors of the book Living African Feminist Theory, Young People's Reflections on Gender, Race, Culture, Class, and Sexuality in Contemporary South Africa, which will be published in 2023. Welcome, Dr. Nadia. I request our conveners, Professor Dr. Mala Panduram and Dr. Draupadi Chattopadhyay, to kindly felicitate our keynote speakers, Dr. Megan Jones and Dr. Nadia Sanger, please.
No, I haven't checked this. Has it started? I'll connect this, and if it doesn't work,
speakers.
choose the normal mic. No, it's connected to the speaker. This is a transmitter receiver. They have the yeah. I have my own mics, but then that's too bulky to carry.
Good morning, everyone. First, let me say that I am a little bit nervous. And I'm always nervous when I have to stand in front of a group of people and speak. And I think, you know, when you, as a scholar, you never really get used to that. It's just part of the job. It's something we have to do in different spaces in the world and in our own spaces, but we never grow accustomed to actually standing in front of people and hoping that we will impress them. I am hoping I will impress you today. I don't think so, but I'll try. Thank you to our colleagues here at Dr. BMN College and then SNDT Women's University. It's been fantastic. The conversations that we've had for the last 2 years. I am so pleased to be here. I am feeling extremely overwhelmed that we got here. We are in India, we are in your space, and we are learning about you and your world in ways that I would not have dreamed possible. So thank you. It is highly significant that this workshop that we have titled Talking Across Cultures is taking place. This making space for conversations between India and South Africa in terms of feminist theory and practice is an attempt at bringing the center to the center, knowledge and methods that emerge from our respective spaces, India and South Africa, and all the tiny spaces within those larger spaces. In the last day and a half, we've been having lots of conversations as part of this workshop. There have already been intense conversations about what it means and can mean to do this kind of work across our respective spaces. What are we able to shift and change in the world through the creation of the knowledge that we are trying to build during this workshop? What does it mean? What will it mean for your future, for the future of young people across different spaces in the global South? There's a long history of feminist thought and activism from the global South,
I can keep
but a
my
lot
bags here.
of that knowledge has not made it to the center,
Okay, I was just gonna-
and we need to center that in order to make sure that it matters. It's feminist
So I
knowledge
can
that
keep my
matters.
phone
So
here also.
as my colleague said earlier, it's really
Here
about
and then leave. So that I
how
can
we do
keep it
not look to
charging,
the
right?
north for information about our own lives, but about placing our lives in the
I'll
center
just keep it on
and
silent.
calling that theory. Theory
But
should
you
not
have
be
the
this
keys, no?
large
So you
thing
say.
that's intangible, something that comes from somewhere else.
you
where
want,
people
then
tell
I'll
us
carry the
how we
phone
need to
if you
behave, how we need to think, what we need to do, and who we need to be in the world. We need to be able to construct our own theories based on the legitimacy
I can
of
keep
our
it
own
for
lives.
charging.
It's about dignity and it's about self-respect.
What?
And when the North is making claims to our identities in different parts of the global South, that for
Not,
me
I'll be on
is further perpetuation of colonization, colonial acts, and really leads to undignified practices that are deeply unethical. So this project is so important precisely because we are busy building knowledge that matters to us. We get to tell the North, this is who we are. So the term Global South does not refer to a cannot refer to a homogeneous collective of spaces and experiences. Since these spaces have different histories, you have different histories on your continent, in your country, and we have equally multiple different histories in South Africa. There's all sorts of stereotypes that people have about India and that people have about South Africa. And we always have to check ourselves because this is part of what it means to live as a feminist in the world, to question what it is that we think about other people and rather to ask them what they think about themselves. So it's so important to understand that South Africa is not one large space with people who all think the same way and have the same access to opportunities in the same way as I know this is the case for India. There's so many inequalities in both spaces, and that's one commonality that draws us together in ways that are important in terms of building alliances, which is what we are trying to do. Of course, there are also differences, and we celebrate those differences and we talk about them. We are always in conversation. One of the most important aspects of feminist thinking and feminist work is that we remain in conversation and we're open to listening to what the other has to say. I'm going to have to shorten because I know that we have 20 minutes. So I'm going to quote Chandra Mahanti, because in my own studies of gender and women's studies many years ago, Mahanti and Spivak were central to my own learning and my own thinking about my world. So there are always ways that we draw on, I think, theories that might not have emerged directly from our space, but in similar spaces in the global South. And Mahanti wrote Under Western Eyes in 1984 already to engage questions about subalternity and the idea of the marginalized subject in relation to the center, the West. And of course, it was a lot more complex than that. What does this idea of post-coloniality and feminist thinking and practice mean in India and South Africa today? What does post-colonial mean? Are we post-colonial? A lot of scholars would argue that we are neo-colonial. In other ways, processes and global processes and practices have changed, but the ethics might not have shifted really. So that it might be more appropriate to talk about neo-colonial spaces rather than post-colonial. that colonialism is over and we are now free. That is not necessarily what is happening in the world. The fact that we have such high levels of inequality and poverty and violence indicates that we're not free of colonial practice. How does engagement with literature and culture, which is part of the project that we have in India and South Africa, allow us to frame feminist work that, while focused on gender and power, also understands the intersections with place, space, and specificity? And in a little bit, Dr. Jones will offer us some examples of how the creative enables such feminist engagement. Aurora Swati talks about Mohanty's idea of a feminist solidarity that is couched within decolonial thinking that requires an understanding of the historical and experiential specificities and differences of women's lives, as well as the historical and experiential connections between women from different national, racial, and cultural communities. And that's a quotation. In South Africa, this difference between women is intensified by racialized history of both colonialism and oppression. The practice of intersectionality, and I know you all will be familiar with that feminist term, has a long history and is therefore likely to have been engaged in feminist theory and activism long before it was actually coined as such by Kimberly Crenshaw in the United States. So feminists were doing intersectional work long before it became a very popular term now, intersectionality. Women's realities are different from men's, we know that, but they are also different from each other. So in South Africa, this is very evident in the ways that race and class mediate gender, and our conversations yesterday about India and caste reflects that there are similar concerns about who owns knowledge and how this knowledge becomes disseminated as dominant feminist voices in India. Women of color are situated variously in terms of race, class, caste, and sexuality, and therefore have differential access to resources and opportunities. So feminist activism in South Africa, for instance, is split between women's rights organizations, non-governmental organizations, where mostly women of color do the work, and academia, where in our recent past, at least, white women theorized about gender and other forms of power using feminist frameworks from the North. There's a big noise about this in South Africa. Feminists of color are saying, we're not accepting that those theories are the theories of our lives. So there's the transnational across spaces on the globe, as in this project between India and South Africa, and the differences in our lives and commonalities, but there's also huge things going on in each of our spaces in terms of women's lives and the differences between women. Decoloniality is critical to research on Southern feminisms. In her relatively new book, and now I just got to figure out how to get to the next slide. Oh, I forgot the next one. In a relatively new book, Decolonization and Afrofeminism, Sylvia Tamale describes decolonization as the various processes of deconstructing colonial interpretations and analyses of the social world in ways very much in line with Frantz Fanon's views in The Wretched of the Earth, which you all need to read if you haven't read it yet. For the colonized, argues Tamale, decolonization of the mind is really about returning to history, to find ourselves, to become fluent in our cultural knowledge systems, to cultivate critical consciousness, and to reclaim our humanity. In South Africa, you shouldn't have given me the water. In South Africa, a lot of this kind of work is happening. The Roads Must Fall campaign, which I'm sure some of you might be familiar with, a few years ago, is an important example of the kinds of questions that must be asked about our education systems and the content of this education that moves us away from the knowledges and ways of being that cultivated who we are as human beings in the world. Feminists, particularly in the South, have been doing decolonial work for decades. Yesterday's exhibition on women change makers, we had the opportunity to see this exhibition at the museum in India, does similar work, even though we must always be critical of whose knowledge is being constructed as hegemonic within feminist articulations about women and gender. So Arushani governed this paper titled South African Indian Women as Custodians of Subversive Knowledge, offers a reading of Francine Simon's poetry, who describes herself as an Indian South African, which demonstrates decolonial feminist values through its subversive representation of South African Indian women and the indigenous knowledge specific to South African Indian culture. And Dr. Jones will talk about the largeness of the Indian community in South Africa. In her poetry, Simon is responding essentially to Sylvia Tamale's call for becoming fluent in our own cultural systems. And in this case, it is through the medium of poetry. As Govender rightly notes, movements towards decolonizing not only involve a dismantling and re-examination of colonialism and its lasting impact, but also that for previously oppressed societies, indigenous knowledge and ontology play a vital role in reclaiming autonomy and self-worth. It's about dignity. It's about how we move through the world as dignified human beings. Poetry as a creative medium is one way through which women's writing, for example, decolonizes. So, not unlike India, some of our major social problems in South Africa include poverty, unemployment, and violence of all types, including South Africa has the highest rate of sexual violence in the world. We are deeply unequal, and the inequalities can be read spatially. This is one part of South Africa. This is Durban. In fact, this is where a large part of the Indian South African community resides. And this is one, there are many such images that indicate the spatial inequalities in the country. So you'll see there's, might be working class or poorer communities on the one side, and then these large spaces where wealthier people live. And in South Africa, while the middle class is growing, most wealthy people remain white. And it's race is a major thing in South Africa. Post-COVID has seen more poverty, and we are not sure about the violence statistics yet, although it seems like there was more gender-based violence that happened during the lockdown periods in South Africa. But the pressure COVID exerted on humans, the pressure the pandemic exerted on humans, particularly those already struggling to survive economically, means that there is likely to be the enactment of more violence against each other. Violence is a major thing in South Africa that researchers are working on. Sexual violence is one form of violence, but aggression and the ways in which people engage each other every day is very different to what I've seen in India. It's something I can't theorize about it yet because I haven't been here long enough. I would need to live here in particular spaces in order to understand that. But there's definitely a different way in which you engage each other in space that is different to the kind of aggression I think exists in South Africa. One of the questions of post-colonial feminisms then should be, or neo-colonial feminisms or feminisms across different spaces, how can working transnationally help us deal with violence, poverty, and inequalities in our respective spaces on the globe? If feminism is about everyone having the right to live a dignified life, because essentially that is what it's about, how does transnational work help us do this? So I've got one more page, and I'm not sure if I should continue in terms of time or if I should pass on to Dr. Jones. Should I finish? Swati, not that Swati, Aurora Swati, argues that creative work is a critical way in which we are able to produce knowledges about women's worlds. Her focus on the act of walking in India and in South Africa I find particularly interesting and useful for feminist thinking and geopolitics. She argues that walking, just walking in your space, walking every day, walking to the station, getting on the bus, walking to get some food, walking to go out with your friends, must be contextualized by not just the city it is embedded in, but also the gender, class, caste, ability, age, sexuality, religion, and ethnicity of the walking body. Walking, argues Swati, is embodied. Who walks, how we walk, the freedom we have to walk within particular spaces. And we know that women's freedoms are curtailed in terms of public space. She has a discussion in her article on two plays titled Walk in India and South Africa, and as produced as creative works of resistance against sexual violence in both countries. Swati offers us a means to decolonize walking, not as a practice of adventure and exploration, but as in Maya Rao's Walk in India, as more a form of informing, warning, cautioning women. So essentially, I know when I travel to places in the north, it's a very different experience than walking in my own country. Walking in my own country is about my central nervous system constantly being under attack. I'm always looking over my shoulder. I'm always careful. I don't go to certain places at night. Don't travel public transport at certain careful. When I'm in the north, certain places in the north, of course, in Europe in particular, that experience of walking is very different. It's an adventure. I feel freer. I feel like I don't need to worry so much about what's going on. I understand, and I agree with Swati, that my experience in my own country is very much linked to what is happening in the global north. And the reason my country is in the space that it's in is because it's tied so closely historically to colonialism. And I have to constantly remind myself of that. Living in the everyday with that knowledge is hard because you have to live, you have to walk, you have to do stuff, you have to live a life. But at the back of my mind, I mean, there are times when I think I'd like to go and live somewhere else where I feel I don't have to carry the stresses of worrying about violence. But I know all the work that has to be done in my country. I'm going to jump. Nfa Abenyi proposes that a pluralistic post-colonial discourse be initiated through discovering manifold theories that inexplicitly exist in language, oral literature, and fiction. So what is fiction? What is oral literature? What does it offer us in terms of thinking about decolonization across spaces and within our own spaces? Any attempt at feminist transnational work between India and South Africa must prioritize equal power relations, non-hierarchical communication, and reciprocal empowerment as prerequisites. Those are central. Creative work across our national boundaries can open space for what De Souza calls decolonial contact zones. And you'll notice I'm in conversation with other theorists. I can't claim this as my own words because they're simply not my own words. I'm going to hand over to Megan now to offer us some more examples of the possibilities of creative works for feminist decolonial thinking. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Thank you for coming. And just want to repeat what Dr. Sanger said. A big thank you to our colleagues here in India for hosting us and for organizing such a fantastic conversation and experience, which will continue today. So what I'm going to do really is I'm going to be showing you a poem. I'm going to show you an extract from a novel, a short story, and I'm also going to show you some artwork by South African Indian women. So I want to say, obviously, I am not a South African Indian woman. So this is not my experience. It's not my area of expertise. And what I'm going to talk about today can't really do justice to the depth and the complexity of what it means to be of the Indian diaspora in South Africa. So there's actually a lot of work that's been done on the connections between India and South Africa, as Drupati was pointing out, and I'll mention some of those scholars as I go along. But mostly what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at some texts. I'm going to show you a map of South Africa so you can see where everything is, and I'm going to show you a historical timeline as well. But let's start with Francine Simon. So Dr. Sanger just mentioned her poetry. Which way forward? The right one. Okay. So this is from a collection that was published in 2017. And it's called Naming Places. So what this poem is about, it's about the arrival of indentured laborers in South Africa in 1860. So most of South Africa's Indian population is descended from these indentured laborers. So this poem is about processes of, well, it's asking the question of who is remembered and who is forgotten. And we're going to see as we talk through these poems and these extracts and look at the artworks that this is one of the main themes of South African Indian identity, is a feeling of being forgotten in the wider picture of South Africa. I think as Dr. Sanger has tried to point out to you, the history of South Africa has been one that seems to have been dominated by conflict between a minority white population, that's me, and a majority indigenous Black African population. And for many Indian diasporic people in South Africa, the question is, where do we fit in here? Where do we belong? And do we belong in India still, or do we belong in South Africa? So I'm going to go back to this poem. I just want to show you this map, okay? Because we've been talking about all these places and maybe you don't know where they are. Okay. Later. All right. My technology is not very good. All right, this one. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So this is Durban. This is where the majority of South African Indian population lives, right? And this is where that boat that I mentioned, at the Truro in 1860, this is where that boat arrived. And most of the people that I'm talking about today, most of these women, writers and artists, they live around here. Can you hear me? I'm shouting. Okay, so Dr. Sang and I are from here, Cape Town. And there is also a South African Indian population around Cape Town and also up here, Johannesburg. But I'm going to talk a little bit later about why it is that most of South Africa's Indians still live here. Okay, and that a lot of that has to do with apartheid and the way apartheid prevented people of color from moving around. Okay, so let's look at some of these dates here. So, as you know, as Trupati pointed out, the links between South Africa and India predated colonialism. Maritime links, particularly with trade, obviously. But the South African Indian population really comes into being through slavery in the 1650s with the Dutch settlement. You know, I showed you that picture of Cape Town with the Dutch settlement of Cape Town. And obviously that was looking for a route to India, the Dutch East India Company. So there were Indian slaves, but as I said to you before, most people arrived 150 years ago as indentured laborers. So it's a complicated and often painful history. I don't know if you know that Mahatma Gandhi also lived in South Africa for 20 years more. And that his Satyagraha, am I saying it correctly? That campaign was something that he formulated while he was in South Africa. So the most important dates for us there are 1948. This is when you've heard of apartheid. This is when apartheid becomes a thing. Okay, before that, a colonial government, but it's you know, in South Africa, it's quite a divided country. So even the white people don't like other white people. So you have an Afrikaans speaking people of European descent and English speaking. So this is an Afrikaans speaking party, and they are the ones who institute this thing called apartheid. And in 1950, this is also an important date. There's a piece of legislation called the Group Areas Act. And what that means is the government comes in, it takes people out of their homes, out of their communities, it forces them to move to less desirable living areas. Because all the nice places, all the places in the city are for white people. And so people of color were put into what are called townships. And those are very poor, deprived areas. They're often on the edges of the cities, okay? And in some ways, South Africa still works like that. So the biggest township outside Durban where Indian community lives is called Chatsworth. But let's look at this poem. What this poem is talking about, it's talking about a history of erasure, of being lost. When they came on the boats, one name was Sing, the other said and sung, lost. So you'll see that, I mean, these names are repeated throughout the poem. Sing, Naya, Gabriel, Pillai. And that is a way of countering that loss, of giving those people names. But what emerges in these texts, in these works by South African Indian women, is that sometimes this loss cannot be recovered. Sometimes these names cannot be sung in this new place that is hostile to these indentured, but it also despised them. Similar thing happened with the with the Black indigenous population. White people needed them to work, but they also despised them. So, and this is part of what this book is doing, and we're going to see in these other texts, is this creating, and we were talking about this yesterday, trying to create another kind of archive, another kind of history, a living archive, a women's archive, to refer to that will speak back to this erasure. You know, this crossing out of these people and their stories. And I think what's quite interesting, you know, is the sense of do these names from India, do they fit in South Africa now? Or will we always be displaced here? So you notice she says, she's talking about her father at the end. She says, we don't know my father's family. We are the last of the Simons. Nothing left for his daughters but to be girls. So on the one hand, it's saying femaleness is an absence. Femaleness is a nothing. But on the other hand, it's saying, well, you know, maybe Francine Simon and her sister, they can forge a new identity and new narratives without this burden of a patriarchal history in a way. And that is what this book does, because the book it draws on her aunties, her grandmother, her mother, to tell different kinds of stories. But they're often sad stories. Okay, so let's move to an extract from a novel. So this is a recent novel. It was published last year, Joanne Joseph's. It's called Children of Sugarcane, and it is about those indentured laborers who were brought to work on the British-owned sugarcane farms. I am a migrant connected to my home by fragile threads that stretch across continents. They are too frayed now to hoist me back to the life I knew, to the girl I once was. Yet sometimes a longing for the place of my birth takes hold of me, and it pains me to be torn from all that was familiar to me, all whom I loved in India. So this character is speaking from South Africa, from what was then the colony of Natal. So in this book tells the story of Shanti, who is a young woman who flees India. She flees a forced marriage, and she gets on a boat and she goes to South Africa, where she is forced into labor, where she is raped by her white master, and then she kills him. So this section that we're seeing here, it's right at the beginning of the book, and she is telling her story from her prison cell. So eventually we find out she goes back to India. She manages to get out of South Africa. She goes back to India. She becomes a teacher. But I think it's important that the book starts kind of from imprisonment, because it's telling us about the psychological and the physical violence of those spaces against those human beings. So you'll notice that she says that people were viewed like waste onto the land, which is, telling us about how the colonial system understood and treated these Indian laborers, which is that they were objects. Okay, it turned them into things. There's a famous quote by Aimé Césaire, colonization equals thingification. You turn people into objects, you turn them into things, you rob them of their memories, you rob them of their sense of place, you rob them of themselves. And so there's a risk that Shanti will become lost, like those people that Francine Simon is writing about. But I want you to also notice here that there is a sense of connection and a claiming of connection to this new landscape, this new place of the colony of Natal in South Africa, because she says, I've grown fond of the landscape. I thought maybe I won't go back. Maybe I will reroute myself here. And that in a way is the beginning also of saying, yes, we can be here. So as I said to you, Shanti returns to India, but I want us to think now about those communities, the majority of people who came from India, who stayed in South Africa. So we're moving now to the mid-20th century, okay? So this is an extract from a short story. It's short stories, it's from stories from the Asiatic Bazaar by Mutal Naidu, who is amazing. She's 87 years old. And she also publishes these diaries online called the Octogenarian Diaries. So this story is set, you know, I showed you Johannesburg on the map. Do you remember? Shall I go back? No, you remember. So this story is set in a city near Johannesburg called Pretoria. And Boma, who is the child focalizer of the story, is living in an inner city suburb called Maritzburg, which is a very poor suburb of the city. We're very diverse, okay? So we see in this extract, you know, Boma's talking about her teacher and she's talking about her parents. Her teacher, Mrs. Lamprecht. So Mrs. Lamprecht is Afrikaans. She's a white Afrikaans person. And, you know, what's interesting here is that Mrs. Lamprecht and Boma's parents, even though they are to some extent all victims of British colonialism, they all listen to BBC radio. What is that showing us? It's showing us the entanglement of living under systems of oppression, that you can both resist it and in some ways be complicit. But it's also showing us connections across race and ethnicity. And I think that's quite a hopeful, you know, that's quite a hopeful relationship that we're given here between Boma and her white teacher. And, you know, what also notice here the sort of anti-British feeling alongside that. The family have to move, okay, the family have to move back to Durban. Why do they have to move back to Durban? Because the apartheid government has not given them permits to live in Pretoria. They're actually not allowed to be there. And so they are forced to go back to Durban. In South Africa under apartheid, if you were a person of color, there were parts of South Africa you could not stay the night if you did not have a permit. There were whole states that you could not stay the night in, you could not travel through. So on the one hand, we have the sense of everyday interconnections and across race, and on the other hand, we have a very strong sense of people's movement and people's lives being controlled by this white minority government. And this legacy of colonialism, right? That the British royal family are visiting South Africa at the same time partition, the same year's partition. Okay, so now I'm going to finish. Now, I'm going to finish with an artist called Al-Qadar. So what we see in Al-Qadar's work is also a repetition of these ideas of non-belonging in a way, of being fragmented or fractured between different spaces, between South Africa, between India. So again, the question is how to recuperate these lost histories, these women's stories. So this is some of her work, and this is a quote from her. Where does the pain go? When does it go away? With Indian South African history, we are hardly told the history of our ancestors in school. So in school, Boma, living in 1947, would not have learned anything of her ancestors. It wasn't until I was much older that I questioned this and realized I wasn't alone in asking. When I looked at the images, there was a sense of love and coming home that I felt I needed to share. She wants to use her family archives. So what she's doing is she's taking everyday domestic objects, and she's stitching them together in new ways to reframe this painful and in some ways invisible history of her foremothers. And in doing that, she's able to bring both herself as the artist and the audience home to India and to South Africa. So what I'd like to end with is a video. So I don't know, I'll only show a minute of the video. So just a warning, this video is Al-Qadar is part of an artist collective called the Kuti Collective. And they obviously take that word and using it differently. And they're a group of young South African Indian artists who bring in ideas of also queerness and gender non-binarism into their work. And they bring in ideas of, we want to be artists, we want to enjoy ourselves, to have a sense of leisure and pleasure. Because for Indian South African, you know, the identity is about work. That is the narrative of labor and exploited labor. So I'm going to end by showing you quickly a little bit of that video.
QC's means bitch. Yeah. The word historically used, created, sustained by patriarchy. We are bitches, we don't like you, we're difficult, cannot be controlled, don't want your attention, resist gender roles. By adopting the word cutie, we subvert original projected meaning and attempt to re-establish our power and agency.
Growing up was that the notion of being an artist wasn't exactly something that was completely accepted. And I think that sort of comes from an inherently social place, especially of South African Indians, because South African Indians historically come from a place of work. We were
and their brilliance and their telling of their life and story. Thank you.
I'm sure with our keynote addresses, I think the audience have been left spellbound. Dr. Nadia has certainly given us a lot to ponder about redefining feminism in the post and the neo-colonial world. And we're sure to think about more of the South-South spaces of the world. And Dr. Jones, thank you so much for sharing these wonderful literary works and works of art. And I'm very interested with the term Desi South Indian African women. And I'm sure we've been introduced to that term today, and we're sure to look up and read up on that. So thank you so much, Dr. Nadia. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Ma'am, I request you to kindly take your seat in the auditorium, because we're going to move on to the next segment, which is a lecture demonstration on weaving together women's voices by Ms. Sanjukta Wagh. And I request Ms. Rima Jose from Dr. BMN College of Home Science to introduce Ms. Wagh to the audience.
Thank you, Lakshmi ma'am. I will humbly try to introduce Ms. Sanjita, whose work to me is so dynamic and important, as you will see today. Sanjukta Wagh is the co-founder of an interdisciplinary initiative called Beach in Mumbai, which is engaged in exploring the creative process and improvisation, alternative methods of classical dance pedagogy, and collaborative performance since the year 2005. Performer and educator, Sanjukta Wagh has trained extensively under Rajashri Shirke in Kathak and Pandit Murli Manohar Shukla in Hindustani music. Her dance theatre work, Rage and Beyond, Iravati Gandhari's won 2 National Theatre Awards at Meta in 2015. An MA in English Literature, she has researched and created the text for several of her own productions. She has been the curator for dance at the Kala Ghoda Festival in the years 2009, 2012, and 2013. She has been honored with several awards and scholarships, including the Sur Singer Samsad Singer Money and British Council's Charles Wallace Scholarship, among others. Her lecture cum demonstration today is titled Weaving Together Women's Voices. Welcome, Ms. Sanjita.
Thank you, Ms. Reema. I request Dr. Draupadi Chattopadhyay to kindly felicitate Ms. Sanjukta before her performance.
Hello, everyone. What a pleasure to be here at the SNDT University, where I passed out some odd 20 years ago. And it's indeed a great, great pleasure. A disclaimer, I stand in front of you with a runny nose and a broken leg. And I'm going to try my best to dance because I tore a ligament in my right knee in July. So I'm not going to be able to move, but we are going to try and do something that I call an embodied performance. Because there was a famous dancer, Martha Graham, who once said that I'm not interested in how you move. I'm interested in what moves you. And this is one among several quotes that has led me to a journey. And it's been a journey in which I've been collecting poems and songs and dances and steps from across cultures. I stand here as a practitioner of Kathak, a classical dance form. And I totally understand what happened when the classical dance forms were introduced in India as part of the nationalist project, where they were almost made to be ambassadors of the country, and they were supposed to be high art. And these forms, which were supposed to be storytelling forms, which brought people together, actually became very, very exclusivist languages of dance. But I have been trying to reclaim the form Kathak and speak through it, and not just perform the repertoire of Kathak, which is usually taught in Kathak dance schools, but speak different voices in Kathak from across cultures, from across faiths, and just a collection of many voices is what I'm going to present to you today. And let me start with, thank you. I was really moved by your presentations, your keynote presentations. And I think we'll move from South Africa to India, to our city, in fact, the city of Mumbai. And I would like to start with the poem of one of my mentors and friends, Arundhati Subramaniam, which kind of situates us in present time Mumbai. I wake in the morning to find the city outside my window. A giant mouth that's forgotten how to close. The telephone rings. Each ring a reminder that I have been detected. That I am she who's never on the right platform. She whose emails pile up unanswered, whose checklists grow tangled, matted, unchecked. That I'm she who turns away from importune hands at car windows. She who smiles when she doesn't mean it. She who didn't vote at 3 elections. But what nobody guesses is that I am she who stalks the dark alleys, hungry to annihilate anyone who tries to tame her with clammy, malarial tentacles of guilt. And on full moon nights, she even dares to look the world square in the face and say, no. So with that, from Mumbai city, let's zoom in more to the SNDT University, Churchgate, in 2002, where I was studying. One of my colleagues is here. I'm very happy. Manisha, Drupadi, all of them are still there. And in this university, actually, I was introduced to wonderful women's voices. And one of them was an African-American voice, Ntozake Shange, who has a 24-page long poem called For Colored Girls Who've Considered Suicide When the Rainbow is Enough. And I was reading this poem like we're all supposed to read, complete our syllabus. And for the first time, a character from the poem jumped out at me, held me by the collar and said, dance me now. And I was a Kathak dancer. And suddenly this passion flower of Southwest Los Angeles jumps across continents and compels me to dance her. And I barge into Dr. Pal's office. Dr. Pal used to be my professor, and say, I'm not going to write this assignment, I'm going to dance it. And she said, sure. It was lovely to have professors who were that open. And this is the next piece I'm going to present, just to bring home something that happened when I was about your age, 20 years ago. And I present Lady in Red. Just give me 2 minutes to do a bit of a warm up because my feet are kind of dead. When I give you the sign, you can play the song. orange butterflies and aqua sequins ensconced between slight bosoms. Silk roses darting from behind her ears. The passion flower of Southwest Los Angeles meandered down Hoover Street, past dark, shuttered houses where women from Louisiana shell peas around 3 and send their sons whistling to the store for fatback and black-eyed peas. She glittered in heat and seemed to be looking for rides when she wasn't, and absolutely eyed every man who wasn't lame, white, or nodding out. She let her thigh slip from under her skirt, crossing the street. She slowed to be examined, but never looked back to smile or acknowledge a sincere, "Hey, mama," or meet the eyes of someone purposely finding something to do in her direction. She was sullen, and the rhinestones etching the corners of her mouth suggested tears. Fresh kisses that had done no good. She always wore her stomach out, lined with small iridescent feathers. The hairs around her navel seemed to dance, and she didn't let on that she knew from behind her waist was aching to be held. The pastel ivy drawn on her shoulders to be brushed with lips and fingers smelling of honey and Jack Daniels. She was hot, a deliberate coquette who never did without what she wanted, and she wanted to be unforgettable. She wanted to be a wound, a memory to every man arrogant enough to want her. She was the wrath of women in windows, fingering old shades, lace curtains, camouflaging despair and stretch marks. And so she glittered, honestly, delighted she was desired, and allowed those especially scheming, tactful suitors to experience her body and her spirit tearing, so easily blending with theirs, and they were so happy and lay on her lime sheets, full and wet from her tongue. She kissed them reverently, even ankles and edges of beards. At 4:30 a.m., she arose, moving the arms and legs that trapped her, and she sighed, affirming the sculptured man, and made herself a bath of dark musk oil Egyptian crystals and Florida water to remove his smell. To watch the rhinestones fall beneath her buttocks like pebbles in a Missouri creek. In water, she became herself, brown braided woman with big legs and full lips, regular. Seriously intending to finish her night's work, she walked up to her guest, straddled on her pillows, and began, "You'll have to go now. I have a lot of work to do and can't with a man around. Here are your pants. There's coffee on the stove. It's been very nice, but I can't see you again. You got what you came for, didn't you?" And she smiled. She could have been slapped upside the head or verbally challenged, but she never was, because the ones who had fallen prey to the hips painted with orange blossom and magnolia-scented wrists had wanted no more than to lay between her sparkling thighs. And she had been so divine, so devastatingly bizarre the way her mouth fit round, and now she stood a regular colored girl, full of the same malice, livid indifference as a sister worn from supporting a would-be horn player or waiting by the window, and they knew and left in a hurry. She gathered her jewels and tinsel from her tub and laughed gaily or vengeful. She stored her silk roses by her bed. And when she had finished writing an account of her exploit in a diary embroidered with lilies and moonstones, she placed the rose behind her ear and cried herself to sleep. The passion flower of Southwest Los Angeles comes to Banaras. little did I know then that I was actually channeling someone really close to home, someone who's part of my dance history, the Tawaif, who has been erased from the history of Kathak for generations. And it has been proclaimed to be an art which is propagated by male gharanedars. But she was the carrier of the form in her song, in her being, and she has been displaced, and it's never spoken about in Kathak history. Even today, when you learn the history of Kathak, you'll be full of men. So that brings me back to her words, who is remembered and who is forgotten. Another very interesting paper we had when I was doing my MA was the Native American literatures. And another poet that inspired me was Joy Harjo, who's a Creek poet. And I used Joy's work in a piece that I did called Putana and I. And Putana is a myth about this demoness who poisons baby Krishna by actually putting poison on her breasts. And then she's suckled to death. So the myth goes, the breast she offered was full of poison and milk, flashing eyes now suddenly dull. Her voice was silk. The child took her breast and sucked it right off her chest. Her corpse spread out from north to south. She lay there, deadly mother, happy demon, found life in death. Oh, terror with a baby face, suck me dry, drink my blood, renew my breath. This is a poem by A.K. Ramanujan. But in reference to Putana being not just a mother, but land that is ravaged. We are right now sitting in a city which is being ravaged before our very eyes with the metro and, and we feel that in our veins. So this is a poem that jumps across personal to political to myth to lots of things. So I found the poem very, very rich. So here I present Joy Harjo with She Had Some Horses. This works. I think my voice will carry though, isn't it? She had horses who were bodies of sand. She had horses who were maps drawn of blood. She had horses who were skins of ocean water. Horses, clay, and break. Who was splintered, red cliff.
horses with long pointed breasts. She had horses with full brown thighs. She had horses who laughed too much. She had horses who threw rocks at glass houses. She had horses who licked razor blades. She had some horses. She had horses who danced in their mother's arms. She had horses who thought they were the sun, and their bodies shone and burned like the stars. She had horses who danced nightly on the moon. She had horses who were much too shy and stayed in stalls of their own revelations. She had some horses. She had horses who called themselves horse. She had horses who called themselves spirit and kept their voices secret into themselves. She had horses with no name. She had horses with books of names. She had some horses. She had horses who were afraid in the dark, who were afraid to speak. She had horses who screamed out of fear of silence, who carried knives to protect themselves from ghosts. She had horses who tried to save her, who climbed in her bed at night and prayed as they raped her. She had some horses. She had horses she loved. She had horses she hated. They were the same horses.
That was Joy Harjo. So apart from the very, very intense voices that you heard, there were some really fun voices. So I'm going to go to a fun voice. The last African-American poet that we have, Gwendolyn Brooks. And I composed her poem rhythmically in Kathak. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We pin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. Right when you were doing your keynote, I was sitting and compiling what I should do. So I thought I want to do something on women of faith and also women who are faithless and everything in between. So I want to do next, and this is going to be in some Indian languages across the subcontinent. So it's a Bengali poem by Kobita Sinha, and it's called Ishwar Ke Eve. Eve speaks to God. The translation is by Pritish Nandi. This was a feminist poet's early 20th century, I think. Yes.
ta, ka, ta, ki, 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 ta, I was first to realize that which rises must fall. Inevitably, like light, like dark, like you. I was first to know. Obeying you or disobeying, it's the same. I was first to know. I was first to touch the tree of knowledge. First to bite the red apple. I was first. First to distinguish between modesty and immodesty. By raising a wall with a fig leaf, I changed things totally. I was first. I was first pleasure. My body consoled the first sorrow. I was first to see your face, a child. Amidst grief and joy, I was first. I first knew sorrow, pleasure, good, evil, made life so uncommon. I was first to break the golden shackles of luxurious pleasure. I was never a puppet to dance to your tune like meek Adam. I was rebellion first on your earth. Listen, love. Yes, my slave. I was the first rebel, banished from paradise, exiled. I learned that human life was greater than paradise. I was first to know.
One of the earliest available women writing in the world is the Therigatha, which is writings by Buddhist nuns in India. So this is a poem, 2nd century BC, Bhadda Kundala Kesa. Once I wandered, hair cut off, covered with dirt, wearing only one cloth. I thought there was a fault where there was none, and I saw no fault where there were. I went out from the day shelter, up Gijahakuta mountain, and there I saw the spotless Buddha, honored by his monks. I bent my knees and worshipped. Facing him, I joined my hands in honor. He said, "Come, Bhadda." That was my ordination. Luna keshi pankadhari ekasati pure charim avajje vajjamarini vajje cha vajjadasini luna keshi pankadhari eka हरिं भजे वज्रमतिनि वज्रेच वज्रदासिनी लूलाकेशी. This was in collaboration with a wonderful fellow collaborator and co-traveler, Shruti Vishwanath. So we jammed in the living room and Luna Keshi came alive one day. There's another one of Shruti's compositions that I'd like to sing. This one is Soirabai. Soirabai is one of the Marathi Varkari poets, and she talks about the body. And Soira says, where does the body begin and end? And who decides what is pure? She says that bodies begin in other bodies. The body is polluted, so they say, and the soul spotless, sparkling clean. The body, she births pollution, they say. Cleansed by ritual, what dharma does a body attain? Pollution arises at the source of birth, they say. Tell me, which body of the world wasn't born this way? Perhaps that's why the bodiless one is pure. Sure, they say. As pollution can only be of the body. The body's pollution is accorded by other bodies, says the Mahari of Sukha. Dehasi vital म्हणती सकळ देहासी विटाळ म्हणती सकळ आत्मा तो निर्मळ शुद्ध बुद्ध देहींचा विटाळ देहींचा जन्मला सोवाळा तो झाला कवण धर्म विटाळा वांचोनी उत्पत्तीचे स्थान कोण देह निर्माण नाही जगी कोण देह निर्माण नाही जगी देहासी विटाळ म्हणून पांडुरंग म्हणतसे थोर म्हणून पांडुरंग म्हणतसे थोर विटाळ देहांतरी वसतसे विटाळ देहांतरी वसतसे देहासी विटाळ देहाचा विटाळ देहींचा निर्धारी देहाचा विटाळ देहींचा निर्धारी म्हणतसे महारी चोखियाची म्हणतसे महारी चोखियाची देहासी विटाळ देहासी विटाळ देहासी विटाळ In the lockdown, we had lots of Zoom meetings. I'm sure all of us did. And some were very lush meetings across continents. And there was one group that we had formed called Read, Write, Dance, in which we were talking about why we dance and what the dancing body means and what the dancing body means in this time. This is something I wrote. My body is open ground, clad only in sky. All I can really do is keep the ground fertile. What does it mean to find new ground when you are confronted with the cracked, dried up, broken ground of your own body and spirit? How can we till? How can we mend, nourish, rest this ground that you now recognize has been battered and abused for years? Can we accept that it will never be a blank slate? It is what it is. It will never be new, never was, and in the cracks lie the secret to the healing. Can I accept my body with all its blemishes and scars, disabilities and injuries, and truly celebrate it? How can I practice in a city as fractured as Mumbai, in a crazy country like India, where there is no place that is mine to occupy and dream, where everything is jugaad, all of us will know the word. Everything is about making do with and being grateful for because there are others that have much less. How can I create an expanse for myself and my colleagues where we can stroll in and out, can loiter, Shilpa is here, can jam, can hold and be held, create a space where whispers are valued, and so is the waiting time. That's me, sorry. And so is the waiting time where something is ready to sprout. There's a beautiful book, and I'm sure you'll hear from Shilpa later today, called Why Loiter? And it's about reclaiming public spaces in the city. And so in honor of that, I would like to present a voice of Zanabai. Zanabai says, डोईचा पदर आला खांद्यावरी, भरल्या बाजारी जाईन मी, हाती घेऊनी टाळ खांद्यावरी वीणा, आता मज मना कोण करी, पंढरीच्या पेठे मांडियले पाल, मनगटावर तेल घाला तुम्ही, जनी म्हणे देवा मी झाले येसवा, निघाले केशवा घर तुझे. Zanabai in the 15th century says, the padar has slipped onto my shoulder. My head is bare, and bareheaded, I will walk the bazaar. I don't give a damn. Who can stop me now? Keshava, I have become your whore, and I'm coming now to wreck your home. That's Zanabai. डोईचा पदर आला खांद्यावरी, डोईचा पदर आला खांद्यावरी, भरल्या बाजारी जाईन मी, भरल्या बाजारी जाईन मी, डोईचा पदर आला खांद्यावरी, डोईचा पदर आला खांद्यावरी, हाती घेऊनी टाळ खांद्यावरी वीणा, आता मझ मना कोण करी, पंढरीच्या पेठे मांडियले पाल, मनगटावर
तेल घाला तुम्ही जणवाणे देवा मी झाले केशवा झाले केशवा तुझे निघाली केशवा तुझे निघाली केशवा तुझे डोळीचा पदर आला डोळीचा पदर आला डोळीचा पदर
Now we move north, across the border actually to Lahore, 16th century. And every year in around March, in Bagmapura Dargah at Lahore, there are twin graves of Shah Hussain and Madhulal, which are celebrated. And that's a wonderful story of syncretism. This Chirhagon Ka Mela, which is like the festival of light, was started by a Sikh king in Lahore. So there used to be a Sufi mystic called Shah Hussain and his young Hindu disciple, Madhulal. And they were very much in love. And their love story is sung about and celebrated even today. Shah Hussain wrote a number of poems. And one of the poems that struck me was why I wanted to do a whole production on Shah Hussain, is because it has a collective women's voice. There's a lot of poems in Indian Bhakti poetry which talks to the divine in an individual woman's voice. And it's not like a hierarchy of human and divine at all. It can be divine as lover, it can be divine as child, it can be divine as friend, it can be, the relationship keeps changing. But in this one, it was the collective women's voice, we the women. And it was a very, very powerful poem. So as soon as I heard Radhika Sood Nayak, she's my collaborator on this, I heard her sing this, I said, I need to dance this, embody this voice. So it says, bad, bad, bad. We are bad, say the women of Sial. Stay away. Sharper than the arrows and swords you hurl at us are the knives of separation. We seek only the beloved. We care not for family, caste, creed, rules, rituals. We seek only the beloved. The thunderstorms that rage inside out. If you think that you are the king of Takht Hazara, we too are the daughters of Sial, no less. We will rise from the ashes and dance like Heer would for her Anja.
बुरियां 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 वे असी बुरियां वे लोका बुरियां 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 वे असी बुरियां वे लोका बुरिया कोल ना बेवे तीरा ते तलवारा कोलो तीरा ते तलवारा कोलो तिखिया बिरहो दिया छुरियां 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 में बुरिया बुरिया बुरियां वे हसी बुरियां वे लोका जे तू तख्त हजारे दासाई जे तू तख्त हजारे दासाई असी स्याला दिया कुड़ियां 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 वे लोका सी कुड़ियां वे लोका बुरिया फूल लाबे या बुरिया बुरिया वैसी बुरिया वे लोका
There is another story of Bahina Bai Chaudhary. This time not of the 15th century. There was another Bahina Bai in the 15th century, but of the 19th century, who was a farmer. And she never learned to read or write, but she used to sing. And people used to say, okay, she's singing and she's making the flour, she's grinding the flour, she's grazing, and she's just spout these things. And her son went on to be a poet of great repute. And when he became famous, he went to the absolute authority of Marathi poetry, Acharya Atre. Sopandev went to Acharya Atre and said, this is my mother's diary. Like, it's not her diary because she couldn't write, but I have written down words that she used to spout and sing, and maybe you'd like to read it. He read it and he was blown away by just the wisdom of this woman. So we have spoken a lot about the body. So one more question that I've had is, where does the body end and the mind begin? Does the body have a mind of its own? Why is there such a huge divide between body and mind? Why do we have to train our minds as university students? Why not the body? And I think Bahina Bai's poem answers these questions because she takes imageries from nature and she likens the mind to waves and sky and grains of sand and various things, and even scorpions. Presenting Bahina Bai Chaudhary.
मन मन वढाय वढाय मन वढाय वढाय उभ्या पिकातल ढोर किती हाकला हाकला येती पिकांवर मन मोकाट मोकाट मन मोकाट मोकाट त्याले ठाई ठाई वाटा जशा वाऱ्यानं चालल्या पाण्यावरल्या रे लाटा मन लहरी लहरी मन लहरी लहरी त्याले हाती धरे कोण उंडारल उंडारल जसा वारा वाहदन मन ज्यहरी ज्यहरी मन ज्यहरी ज्यहरी त्याच न्यार रे तंतर अरे इचू साप बरा त्याले उतारे मंतर मन पाखरू पाखरू पण पाखरू पाखरू त्याची काय सांगू मात आता भत्त भुईवर गेलं गेलं भयात देवा कस दिलं मन असं कस रे घडल कुठे जागेपणी तुले असं सपन पडलं. Oh Lord, did you dream up this mind in a waking state? Is the last line. This is Bainabai Chaudhary, who never learned how to write.
So I think the last thing I will do is from the Mahabharata. And it also actually originated in a seminar like this called Feminisms at the Mumbai University Sociology Department. And this was in collaboration with a very, very dear friend, Professor Geeta Chadda. Iravati Karve was one of the first women anthropologists of India to have gone to study in Berlin. And this piece draws from one of her non-academic texts called Yugan, which is a contemporary interpretation of the Mahabharata. And this poem is inspired by Yugan. And one of the characters from the Mahabharata is this iconic queen with a blindfold called Gandhari. So when I read Yugan, she said, pick up any character. And I said, the character I have most questions for is Gandhari. Why would anyone want to lose a sense organ and tie a blindfold voluntarily? I just couldn't understand it. And then as I embodied the character, I discovered my own blindfolds. And I discovered how alike we were in so many ways. And it was spooky. So she kind of derailed my life. But this poem is also, I become the womb, and the stage space actually becomes a large womb. It's a full 90-minute production called Rage and Beyond Iravati's Gandhari. And it's also about the fruitlessness of war. So I would like to end with the poem. I've written it myself as a response to Iravati Karve's Yugan. Just for those who don't know, Kshatriya is a warrior caste. So there is Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. So Kshatriya is a warrior caste woman, and Gandhari was a Kshatriya woman. na dere na dim di dere na tadare dani. Woman, a woman, a Kshatriya woman births weapons and honor, armor and titles, clad in royal robes of the Kshatriya code. Woman, woman. A Kshatriya woman must comply in the plan and make the Kshatriya man. Her flesh and her blood, lost in a flood of chariots and horses, armor and titles, clad in royal robes of the Kshatriya code. Woman, a woman. A Kshatriya woman knows victory and loss in an instant as the weapons she birthed rise before her eyes and turn to dust like they must, with chariots and horses, armor and titles, clad in royal robes. Thank you. I just want to say that a big thank to Mala ma'am to invite me here, because this was literally the gamut of so many creations that I have done since 2002 to 22, so over 2 decades. It's an honor to be here. Thank you. And I'd just like to say to every young woman here, celebrate yourself and your body as it is now, because there's so much to be unlocked. There's so much power there. You have to just give it attention. That's it. It just requires your undivided attention. Whatever you're doing, your work or your being, and it's craving for that. But we as women are constantly told, "Baad mein, you later, pehle aap, pehle aap." No, prioritize you sitting on that chair now. Go get that food or whatever your body is craving and honor it. Thank you so much.
What an enthralling performance, isn't it? I think you'd all agree. And I'm sure if we had more time on hand, it could go on and on and on. It is a treasure trove of works, ma'am. Thank you so much for introducing us by way of self, by way of story, by way of dance, by way of melodious music. Such wonderful work, literary works with the feminist and the woman as the major character. Thank you very much, ma'am. You kept us spellbound. So the efforts in organizing an event of this extent calls for a note of appreciation, A note of thanks because many hands have strived towards the creation of this event and today. So as we come to the end of the public event today, I would like to place on record my sincere thanks to the keynote speakers, Dr. Nadia Sanger and Dr. Megan Jones from Stellenbosch University, Ms. Sanjukta Wagh for her wonderful performance, the conveners of today's conference, Professor Mala Pandurang and Dr. Daupati Chattopadhyay, for spearheading this conference, co-organizers and organizing committee members from the university, as well as Dr. Bayman College of Home Science. A special thanks to all the delegates who have traveled across the globe and across the nation, a wonderful student audience, and my faculty friends who are present here from different departments. Ms. Ria, thank you for capturing the photo moments, and seamlessly the technical team headed by Mr. Nitin, Mr. Rupesh, Mr. Shashi, and Mr. Nelson, who have been there throughout the program. Thank you very much, one and all. I request all to please rise for the national anthem.
अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मागे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे
To kindly remain seated, the organizing committee members and volunteers, please lead the delegates to Prangan Nursery.